Tonight we journey back to the ancient world to stand beneath the shining bronze feet of the great wonder, the Colossus of Rhodes. But first, come inside, quickly now, out of the night. The library is warm, and the candles are lit. You are safe here. Let the world outside just melt away. The tome for this story is already waiting, its heavy cover embossed with the image of the sun. It smells faintly of sea salt and old metal. Let us open it together. Our story begins. It begins not with a sound, but with the end of a sound. For months the only sounds had been the sharp, terrifying crack of stone on stone, the distant shouts of Demetrius's men, the hollow echo of fear in the cramped streets, and the rhythmic, dreadful pounding of the rams. Now there was silence, a heavy, thick, uncertain silence, coating the city like a second layer of dust. It was a silence that held its breath. And then, after 1,000 heartbeats that felt like 1,000 years, came a new sound, a sound that had been forgotten, a low, agonizing wooden groan. It was the sound of the great bronze-banded gates of Rhodes, the hinges swollen with disuse and damp, dry-rusted from the salt air that could never quite be vanquished, screamed in protest. It was not a sound of triumph. It was a sound of pain, of a body long held in tension finally being allowed to move. The sound scraped along the stone-dusted alleyways, pulling people from their homes, from their huddled corners, like a hook in their very souls. They gathered, faces pale and smudged with soot, their eyes wide and hollow. They watched the bar, thick as a man's chest, being slowly, painfully drawn back by soldiers whose arms trembled with exhaustion. The wood powdered and flaked under the strain, a fine, dry snow of splinters falling to the grimy stone floor. Then came the crack, the first crack of light. It was not a gentle dawn. It was a blade, a sliver of blinding, painful white that cut across the suffocating gloom of the gatehouse. Men and women flinched, raising hands to faces that had not felt the direct, unfiltered kiss of the sun in so very long. The light illuminated the air itself, revealing the swirling universe of particles that they had been breathing. It was an atmosphere thick with the siege, a miasma of pulverized stone, of fine, gritty ash from burned storehouses, the lingering metallic tang of old fear, and the dry, chalky powder of their own crumbling defences, the dust of their long confinement. As the gates opened wider, inch by agonizing, scraping inch, this column of dusty, stale city air moved outwards, and it met the world that had been held at bay. The first true breeze of the Aegean Sea pushed its way in, a living, breathing entity. It was a shock to the senses, a sudden, cold, wonderful violence. It did not just move the air, it replaced it. This new air was sharp and clean and so incredibly wet. It smelled of salt, deep primal brine that scoured the throat and stung the eyes. It smelled of distant, damp seaweed on rocks, of open water, of a horizon so vast it had no end. It smelled, quite simply, of freedom. This scent, this glorious, piercing scent of the sea, crashed against the scent of the city. The two smells met in the gateway and fought a silent, swirling battle. The dust of the siege was dry and warm, and it smelled of everything ending. It was the scent of stone ground to nothing, of wood turned to ash, of packed earth, and of the dry, papery smell of unwashed human skin, of sweat turned stale and sour with anxiety. It was the smell of a tomb, a place sealed away from the living. But the sea was the smell of everything beginning again. It was the promise of ships, of grain from Egypt, of wine from the islands, of a world that was still turning, a world that had not, after all, ended at their walls. The people stood frozen, caught between the two. The wind, this new salty herald, whipped at their threadbare tunics, pulling at their matted hair. It was cold on their skin and they shivered, goose-flesh rising. This coldness was a blessing. It was a reminder that they could feel something other than the close, suffocating warmth of the sea. The sun, their patron Helios, streamed in, and its light was warm, so warm on their faces. They had forgotten. They tilted their heads back, closing their eyes, not against the light, but to feel it better, to feel this painter's stroke of warmth landing on their eyelids, their cheeks, their lips. It felt like a pardon. A collective sound rippled through the crowd. It was not a cheer, not yet. The joy was too deep, too fragile for such a noise. It was a sigh, a deep, shuddering, unison exhale, the sound of 1,000 lungs releasing the breath they had been holding for a year. It was the sound of the tension finally snapping. Tears began to trace clean pathways through the grime on their faces. They were not weeping from sadness. They were weeping because the simple, overwhelming physical sensation of fresh, clean, salty air was too much to bear. They drank it in. They opened their mouths and tasted the salt on the wind, a flavour that scoured the stale, brassy taste of fear from their tongues. Slowly, hesitantly, one man, then a woman, then a child took a step. They moved from the familiar, dusty dark of the city and stepped out onto the drawbridge, into the blinding, beautiful, terrifying light. Their sandals scuffed on the stone, the sound shockingly loud in the new quiet. They were blinking like newborns. The world outside was so big. The blue of the sky was an assault, a colour so intense and vibrant it hurt to see. And the sea, the great, glittering, endless blue of the sea, stretched out before them, shimmering as if paved with diamonds, whispering to them with the gentle, rhythmic shush of waves on the shore. It was a sound they had only heard as a muffled, distant rumour. Now it was a symphony. They had survived. They were breathing dust and sea, the smell of their ordeal and the scent of their deliverance, mixed together in the first clean breath of peace. In the quiet workshops of Rhodes, where the smell of beeswax, cedar shavings, and cold, damp clay hung heavy in the air, there moved a man. He was not a politician nor a soldier. His strength was not in the arm that draws the bow, but in the hand that holds the stylus. His name was Chares of Lindos. And to understand the Colossus, you must first understand the man and the silence from which he came. He was a creature of the studio, a place where the only sounds were the soft shush of a metal scraper on a plaster cast, the gentle tap of a wooden mallet, or the slow, meditative drip of water onto a block of clay. He was the student of the great Lysippos. This was not a small thing. To say you were a student of Lysippos was to say you had learned at the feet of the man who had sculpted the very soul of Alexander. Lysippos had taught his pupils to break the old, stiff, perfect forms. He had taught them to see the body not as a static monument, but as a living, breathing, turning thing. He taught them about the moment just before the action, the athlete scraping his skin, the hero leaning on his club after the labour. He taught them to capture not just the form, but the fatigue, the effort, the life. Chares had learned this lesson well. He had learned to feel the muscle beneath the bronze skin, to see the way light and shadow could create the illusion of breath. And in his quiet studio, surrounded by the ghosts of his master's teachings, Chares now held the single, most impossible commission in the history of the world. The weight of it settled on him, heavier than any block of marble. It was a physical pressure, a tightness in his chest. The city, his city, had asked him to give thanks to the sun god, Helios. But how? How do you, a man of clay and wax, of charcoal and parchment, begin to capture the sun? He was alone in the late hours. The city slept the sleep of the relieved, their nightmares of the siege slowly fading. But for Chares, the sleepless nights were just beginning. The lamp on his table sputtered, the wick drawing up the last of the olive oil, its smell, nutty and warm, filling the small space. He held a stick of charcoal, its end powdery and black. It felt impossibly light in his hand, a feather meant to move a mountain. He began to sketch. The sound of the charcoal on the rough, reedy parchment was like a whisper in the stillness, a dry, scratching sound, like a moth's wing beating against stone. He was not just drawing a figure, he was searching. He drew a face, strong and classical, but it was just a man. He crumpled the sheet. The sound of the paper crushing in his fist was a sharp, sudden violence in the quiet. He started again. He tried to capture the light. He shaded and smudged the black dust with his thumb, trying to create the illusion of a glow of rays bursting forth. But it looked flat. It looked dead. It was the god of light, the god who moves across the sky, who drags the day into existence. How could he make metal do that? How could he make bronze look like it was burning? His ambition was a cold fire in his stomach. He wanted to do more than build a statue. He wanted to build awe. He wanted to forge a shape that would pull the sun from the sky and anchor it to their harbour, a permanent sunrise of gratitude. The charcoal snapped in his fingers, the sharp crack echoing in the profound silence. And then there was the calculation, the number, 100 feet. He would close his eyes and try to feel it. He would stand on the cliffs, the sea spray cold and wet on his face, the salty wind pulling at his tunic, and he would look down. 100 feet, the height of a cliff, the height of a dream or a nightmare. The artist in him wrestled with the form, but the engineer in him, the student of the practical mechanical Greeks, wrestled with gravity, and gravity was a god that was never merciful. He sat for nights, not with parchment, but with scrolls of figures. The abacus in his study, its wooden beads smooth and worn, clicked and clacked, a dry, hollow rhythm in the small hours of the night. The sound was a counterpoint to the distant, soft wash of the sea. Click, clack, click. How much bronze? He tasted stale wine, sour on his tongue as he dipped his pen. The ink smelled metallic of iron gall. He wrote the figures, the weight of the bronze skin, thousands upon thousands of pounds. Click, clack, how to support it. A hollow shell would crumple. It would fold in on itself, a giant crumpled wineskin of metal. It needed bones, iron, a massive hidden skeleton. He sketched the armature, a great iron framework that would be the true statue, the secret at its heart. He thought of the forge, the smell of the sulphur in the coal, the blinding liquid white gold of the molten bronze, the roar of the bellows, the gasp of the hot air. But he had to calculate before the first fire was lit. He had to calculate for the wind. This was the thought that truly kept him awake. The harbour was a funnel. The Aegean winds were not gentle whispers. They were raging, salty fists that slammed into the island. A solid statue would be a sail. It would be pushed over by the first winter storm. He stared at the candle flame, watching it bend and dance in a tiny draught from the ill-fitting shutter. The flame was his terror. He saw his colossus, 100 feet of bronze, catching the wind like that flame, and bending and falling. The sound of it in his imagination was a deafening, thunderous crash, a wave of metal crushing the harbour. He buried his face in his hands. His palms smelled of graphite, ink, and the cold sweat of fear. This was the pressure. This was the crushing, solitary weight of a city's hope. Every day he would walk through the streets, and the people would smile at him. The baker, his hands white with flour, would nod. The children would stop their games. They saw him, Shurs of Lindos, as their saviour, the man who would build their monument of thanks. They did not see the man who lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city sleep. The silence of his room was an accusation. The siege had been a shared terror. This was a solitary one. The pressure was not a sound, it was a feeling. It was the feeling of the rough wool blanket, too heavy on his chest, too warm. It was the feeling of his own heartbeat, a dull, anxious drum against his ribs. It was the taste of ash in his mouth, even though the fires were long out. He would rise, unable to rest, and walk to the window. The air coming in was cold, a damp fish-scale smell from the harbour. He would look out at the moon, a sliver of cold borrowed light, and he would whisper to the god, to Helios, not in thanks, but in supplication, help me bear this, help me make your image stand. He was an artist given the task of an engineer, burdened with the expectation of a priest. He was just a man, with calloused hands and tired red-rimmed eyes, who had been asked to make a god. And the city, in its new-found peace, slept on, entirely unaware that the foundation of their great hope was being laid not on stone, but on the sleepless nights of one single terrified and brilliant mind. The scar of the siege was nowhere deeper than the harbour. This was the city's mouth, its throat, the place it drank in the world and breathed out its commerce. And it was here that Demetrius had focused his rage. Now the Mandrake harbour was slowly coming back to life. The air, which for so long had tasted of sulphur and burning pitch, now carried its old familiar song. It was the scent of brine, sharp and cleansing, but beneath it was the richer, deeper smell of the port. It was the oily, tarry smell of rope, the damp, woody scent of wet hulls, the sharp, silver ammonia tang of fish being gutted on the docks, and the complex vegetal smell of drying seaweed in the sun. The sounds had returned too, the creak and groan of mooring lines taking the strain, the slap of small waves against the stone quays, the distant rhythmic thud of a caulker's mallet, and the cries of the gulls, a sound so normal it was a miracle. Into this nascent returning life came Chiras, and with him the council. They were not in a grand marble-floored room. They were here on the breakwater, the wind pulling at their linen robes, the fine cold spray of the Aegean misting their faces. They stood where the sea was deepest, where the channel was narrowest, the very gateway to the city. The wind was louder here, a constant low whoosh in their ears, carrying the taste of salt to their lips. Chairs said nothing for a long time. He watched a merchant ship, its single patch sail full of the same wind, carefully navigate the entrance. He watched the sunlight, Helios's light, catch the water, shattering into a million points of unbearable brightness. This he knew was the spot, not in a quiet temple grove, not in the centre of the city. It must be here, a statement, a proclamation. It must guard the entrance, a sentinel of bronze to greet every returning sailor and to stand as the last, towering memory for every soul departing. It was a gesture of defiance and of gratitude aimed at the sea and at the sky. He pointed, his hand steady, his finger tracing a spot in the air, a spot where there was only blue sky and empty, roaring wind. "Here," he said, his voice almost lost in the sound of the waves. "He must stand here. He will face the sea. He will face the sunrise. He will be the first thing the sun touches when it comes to us." The council members looked at each other. They tasted the salt on their lips. They felt the solid stone beneath their sandals and the vast, moving power of the sea just a few feet away. They nodded. The decision was as solid, as cold, and as final as the sea-washed stone itself. And so the work began. But a god cannot stand on the bare, rough rock. A god needs a stage, a throne, an anchor to the mortal world. Chairs had sketched it 1,000 times, his charcoal-smudged fingers working late into the night. It would not be of the local honey-coloured limestone. It must be different. It must be pure. A great shipment was commissioned, a fleet of barges that groaned under the weight of a new material. From the islands they brought the finest, whitest marble. Marble that was cold to the touch, even under the ferocious baking heat of the Rhodian sun. The masons came. They were men of dust, but this was not the grey, choking dust of the siege. This was a clean, sharp, bright white dust. It settled in the creases of their leather-brown skin. It whitened their hair and beards. It turned them into living statues. The sound of their work became the new song of the harbour. Not the crack of war, but the steady, rhythmic shink, shink, shink of hundreds of chisels. It was a high, piercing sound, like a flock of metallic birds. It was the sound of shaping. They were not destroying, they were revealing. They were cutting away the noise to find the perfect, clean, geometric form. They polished it, using fine sand and water, a slow, abrasive slurry that hissed and scraped. They worked until the white stone was so smooth, so flawless, that it held no shadow. In the bright sun, it was not white. It was a block of light. It was blinding. You could not look at it directly. It gathered the sun's glare and threw it back at the sea, a second man-made sun low on the water. It was a pedestal worthy of a god, a stark, perfect, brilliant promise of the glory to come. It felt cool and smooth like a river stone, and it smelled of a faint, cold mineral rain, the scent of the deep earth itself now brought into the light. But this stage, this shining white marble, was only the skin. The beauty beneath it, unseen, was the strength. Before the first white block was set, the true foundation had to be laid. This was the heavy work, the work of grunting, sweating men, of thick, fibrous ropes that smelled of hemp and tar, and of massive, groaning wooden levers. They dug down, past the harbour stone, down into the bedrock of the island itself, the noise a dull, echoing thud of picks on stone, and into this wound in the earth they began to lay the first stones. These were not the beautiful, polished marble slabs. These were colossal, rough-hewn blocks of granite, grey and speckled, stones that cared nothing for beauty and everything for weight. The first stone was moved. It was a day of ceremony. The city gathered, silent. The smell of the new mortar was sharp and clean, a mix of burned lime, sand, and fresh water. It was the smell of building. 100 men, bare-chested, the sweat gleaming on their backs, pulled on the ropes. The priests chanted, the sound a low, resonant drone, but the real music was the chant of the foreman, a rhythmic call and response that guided the men. Pull, now, pull, now. The ropes creaked and snapped, sounding like the rigging of a ship in a storm. The great stone, weighing more than 100 men, slid, scraping over wooden rollers. There was a moment of terrible, breath-held silence as it was levered over the edge, dangling, and then, with a low, earth-shaking, it settled into its new wet bed of mortar. The sound was final. It was a period at the end of a long sentence of suffering. It was a sound that travelled not through the air, in the ear, but up from the ground, through the soles of your feet and into your bones. It was a vibration, the promise, the first stone of the future, lay deep in the earth, and the city, together, let out its breath. The foundation, the secret, unseen heart of the Colossus, had begun. The gleaming white marble, so cool and pure, was a beautiful lie. It was a stage dressed for the audience, a skin of perfection. But a statue, a true Colossus, is not held up by its skin. It is held up by what no one will ever see. The true work, the secret, brutal heart of the god, was being born not in the bright, dusty air of the mason's yard, but in the dark, in the smoke, and in the fire. The forges of Rhodes, long accustomed to beating swords into sharper edges, were now tasked with building the bones of a god. The air here was a living thing, thick and heavy in the lungs. It was not the clean, scouring salt of the sea. It was the choking, acrid, stinging smell of sulphur leaking from the mountains of black coal. It was the sharp, metallic, hot smell of iron itself, a scent that tasted like blood and lightning on the back of the tongue. And beneath it all, the simple human smell of scorching heat, of sweat that evaporated the instant it touched the air, leaving a salty, grimy crust on the skin of the blacksmiths. Their faces illuminated from below by the hellish, pulsing orange glow of the pits were masks of soot. The sound, before you heard it, you felt it, a deep, rhythmic oom. It was the sound of the great leather bellows, a dozen of them, huge, creaking, groaning bags of air, the giant lungs of the forge. They pumped a sleeping monster's breath, forcing life into the flames, turning the embers from red to orange to a blinding, furious, liquid-looking white. It was not a gentle crackle. It was a constant, devouring roar, a sound that consumed all other smaller noises. And then the iron would be drawn, pulled from the fire. It was a piece of the sun. It was a terrible, dangerous, captured light, so bright it hurt the eyes, so hot it radiated a physical push. You could feel the heat on your eyelids, a dry, stinging pressure, a wave that forced you to step back. It cast no shadow. It was the Shadow Eater. The master smith, his eyes shielded, would gesture, and the bar, as thick as a man's thigh, would be swung, heavy and dripping sparks, onto the great black anvil. Then came the sound that would define the harbour for a decade. It was not the shink of the chisel, it was a clang, a deafening, concussive, shattering sound, a sound that was not just heard, but felt deep in the chest, a physical punch of vibration. It was the sound of a dozen sledgehammers, their polished wooden handles worn smooth with sweat, striking in unison. There was a rhythm. The master with his small hammer would strike first, a quick, light tap, tap, ting. The high-pitched, clear ting was the command. It was the note, the instruction, the where, and in the echo of that tiny ting the great hammers of the apprentices would answer, a unified, earth-shaking thum, a single monstrous blow. The hot iron screamed. It did not just ring, it shrieked, a high, painful, metallic cry of protest, as its very form was beaten, changed, and forced into a new shape. Tap, tap, ting, thum. Tap, tap, ting. This was the new heartbeat of Rhodes. This was the sound of Chares's calculations. This was the sound of the god's bones being forged. The sound travelled. It left the suffocating, sooty heat of the forge, and it rolled out over the harbour. It echoed off the water, a sharp, metallic report. It struck the new white marble pedestal and bounced back, the sound of hard, violent labour striking the face of calm, cold beauty. The gulls in their flight would hear it and scatter. The merchants, tallying their amphorae, would pause, their calculations momentarily lost in the ringing. It was the sound of the hidden strength, the internal framework, the great secret skeleton of iron bars, each one shaped by fire and force, each one a piece of the puzzle that Charles held in his mind. These bones, black and scarred from the hammer, were hoisted by groaning cranes. They were lowered one by one into the hollow white marble pedestal, the first great ribs of the god's feet, the massive, articulated joints of the ankle. A cage of dark, ugly, brutalist iron rising from the pure white stage. But Shares, in his terror of the wind, knew iron alone was not enough. The framework was strong, but it was hollow. It was a skeleton, and a skeleton can be toppled. It needed weight. It needed an anchor. And so the second hidden secret was brought. Carts, not from the fine marble quarries, but from the rough, granite-strewn hills, rumbled to the harbour. They were filled with rock. Just rock. This was not the stuff of sculptors. It was the stuff of foundations. Grey, speckled, sharp-edged, unlovely granite. It smelled of the deep earth, a cold, mineral, damp scent, the smell of things that have never seen the sun. And the new sound was not a clang. It was a rumble. It was the sound of thousands of stones, a river of rubble being dumped, poured, and packed by sweating labourers, an avalanche in reverse. The stones clattered and crashed, a dry, scraping, thudding noise as they filled the huge, hollow, iron-boned ankles of the god. They were packed in tight, a solid, unmoving mass. Shares was filling his god with the mundane, heavy guts of the island itself. It was ballast, the same principle that kept a ship from capsizing in a storm. The wind could push, but it would be pushing against a mountain, a man-indomitable hidden mountain of stone, locked inside a skeleton of iron. The people saw the white marble. They heard the clang of the hammers, a promise of the metal to come. But they did not see this. They did not see the tons and tons of simple grey rock being buried inside the form, the secret, unglamorous, heavy truth that would, in the end, be the one thing that truly kept the god standing. The Helepolis, the great, lumbering 9-story nightmare that had haunted their sleep, was now a corpse. For months, its shadow had been a moving, terrifying thing, a block of night that slid over the city walls, promising death. Now it lay broken, a colossal, splintered skeleton, its great wooden bones snapped and scattered, and the work of its final, true death had begun. It was the sound of deconstruction, the sharp, splitting crack of axes biting into the thick, siege-hardened timbers, the high-pitched, agonizing scream of giant bronze nails being drawn from the wood by long iron levers. The wood itself, black with pitch and tar, released its scent as it was broken apart. It was a dense, acrid, chemical smell, the smell of Demetrius's war machine. It was the smell of fear. But now, as the men worked, their arms black to the elbows with the sticky resin, the smell was changing. It was the smell of fuel. And then there was the other pile, the mountain. It was a dragon's horde of captured, broken things. It was a hill of terror, now rendered mundane. The mangled, twisted bronze plating from the siege tower, shields stamped with the face of a gorgon, their surfaces dented and scarred. Spearheads by the thousand, their wooden shafts snapped. The heavy cast bronze heads of the battering rams, now silent, their brutish animal forms lying inert in the dust. The sun glinted off the metal, but it was a cold, dead light. This was the raw material of their nightmare, and Sherez, walking through this junkyard of war, felt the cold, smooth metal under his calloused fingertips. He picked up a helmet, its nose guard bent. He could smell the faint, sour tang of old sweat and leather from its lining. This helmet had held a man, an enemy. Now it was just bronze, a resource. This was the great recycling. This was the alchemical, perfect justice of the victory. The very tools of their oppression, the metal forged to break them, would be the metal used to raise them. The weapons of war, every last helmet, every spear tip, every shield would be unmade. They would be fed to the fire. The foundry was a mouth. It was a deep, circular, brick-lined pit, and it was the hottest, loudest, most dangerous place in Rhodes. To approach it was to walk into a wall of heat. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a dry, scouring physical force that pushed against your chest, that sucked the moisture from your eyes, that made the very air in your lungs feel thin and scorching. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal, a deep, sulphurous, choking smell that caught in the throat, and beneath it the sharp, metallic, blood-like tang of the hot bronze itself. The sound was a symphony of labour, the constant thrumming, deep of the bellows, great leather lungs worked by teams of sweating men, forcing air into the heart of the fire, and the fire itself. It was not a crackle, it was a roar, a constant, deafening, hungry sound, the sound of a lion that was never, ever full. It consumed all quiet. The men had to shout, their voices hoarse, their commands lost in the din, communicating with hand gestures, a frantic, silent ballet in the face of the inferno. And into this roar they fed their fear. The blacksmiths, protected only by thick, sweat-soaked leather aprons, would take the shields, the swords, the helmets, and with long iron tongs they would commit them to the crucible. The metal would hit the liquid, white-hot pool of bronze with a sharp, angry hiss. A spray of bright, furious sparks would erupt, a tiny, violent supernova. The helmet, the one that had held a man, would resist for a moment. You could see its shape dark against the liquid light, and then it would simply disappear. It would slump and fold and dissolve. Its form, its identity, its memory of war was erased. The fire was a great forgetting. The shouts of its old owner, the terror of its wielder, all of it was burned away, rendered down to its pure elemental self. Just metal, liquid, anonymous, and new. When the crucible was full, when the metal was a shimmering, churning lake of liquid sun, the moment of creation would come. The master founder would give the signal. The great vat, glowing so brightly it seemed to have no weight, was tipped. A river of light, a thick, heavy, viscous, glowing stream of white gold poured out. The sound of it was a heavy, liquid slosh, a sound that seemed impossible for something so bright. It poured into the moulds. These were not the dark, fiery pits, but their opposite. They were vast, cool, intricate shapes, pressed into beds of fine, damp sand and clay. The smell of the foundry changed in that instant. The hiss was deafening, a scream of steam as the liquid fire met the damp earth. A cloud of white vapour exploded upwards, smelling intensely of burnt minerals, of wet clay being baked in an instant, and then silence. The pour was done. The new plates, the skin of the god, lay hidden, cooling in their earthen graves. The only sound was the faint, sharp tink, tink of the metal contracting as it cooled, a sound like ice breaking, a sound of a new thing settling into its permanent shape. Later, when the heat was no longer a wave of white but a dull, angry red, the moulds would be broken. The crack of the baked clay, the hush of the dry sand being brushed away, revealed the new form. Chairs himself was there for the first one. It was a huge curved plate, the skin of the god's calf. It was still hot, radiating a deep, penetrating warmth that you could feel on your face from 10 feet away. The steam rose from it in gentle, coiling whispers. He reached out, his hand hesitating. He touched it. The surface was smooth, perfect. It was no longer a helmet. It was no longer a sword. It was not a tool of war. The bronze, once screaming with the memory of battle, was now serene. It had been purified, rebaptized in the furnace. It had been unmade, and now it was remade, its purpose transformed from the base metal of war into the shining golden skin of peace. This was not a glorious ascent. It was a burial. Chairs, in his wisdom and his terror of the wind, had understood a truth. You cannot build a god in the open air. The sky is too vast, the winds too cruel, the height too dizzying. You cannot ask men to work, to rivet, to hammer, while dangling 100 feet in the air, buffeted by a salt-lashing gale. No, to build a god, you must first build a grave, and then ask him to rise. And so, the work on the statue began with the sound of shovels, not the bright shink of the chisel on marble, or the proud clang of the forge. It was the dull, repetitive shuff-thud of 1,000 shovels biting into the earth. It was the sound of the land being moved. It was the low rumble of wooden cartwheels, groaning under the weight of rock and soil. It was the constant heavy thump of tampers as men packed the earth down, harder and harder, creating a new, solid ground. A mountain was growing in the Mandrake harbour, a great, sloping brown and grey mass of earth, a ramp that leaned against the god's legs. It smelled of damp soil, a deep, loamy mineral smell that you might find in a freshly ploughed field or a newly dug well. It was the smell of the deep, cool, quiet earth, and it began to overpower the sharp, salty tang of the sea. The harbour, once a place of open sky and water, was now becoming a valley, nestled at the foot of this new man-made hill. The ramp grew with the god. For every layer of bronze, a new layer of earth. For 12 years this mountain was the project. A child born in Rhodes in the year they laid the first foundation stone would know nothing else. She would learn to walk in the shadow of the great brown ramp. For her, this was not a process, it was a feature of the world. She would play at its base, her small fingers digging in the loose soil, her linen tunic perpetually stained with its dark dust. She would look up and up and up and see not a god, but a hill, a strange, sloping, lifeless mountain that had simply always been there, blocking the eastern sun for the first few hours of the morning, casting a cool, earthy-smelling shadow over her games. Sometimes she would press her ear against the packed earth. The ground was warm from the sun, and it felt solid, like the island itself. It smelled of dust and dried weeds. She would listen, and she would hear it, a sound from inside. It was not a clear sound. It was a muffled thud, 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 thud. It was a sound that you felt more than you heard, a vibration that travelled up from the earth, through her cheekbone, and into her very skull. It sounded, she thought, like a giant, a truly enormous giant, with a heart of metal, sleeping fitfully deep, deep inside the hill. Inside that hill, in the darkness, there was no glory. The workers were not sculptors, they were miners. They toiled in a cramped, claustrophobic and suffocating space. The ramp was not a ramp on the outside. It was a cocoon on the inside. A hollowed-out, wooden-braced tunnel followed the rising iron skeleton. The air in here was a horror. It was thick with the dust of the earth, a fine, gritty powder that coated every surface, that got in the eyes, the throat, the lungs. It was thick with the smoke from the small portable forges, their bellows huffing in the cramped darkness, the acrid, sulphurous smell of the charcoal burning with no escape. And it was hot, a close, damp, human heat, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat, and of hot, hot metal. The only light came from these forges, a pulsing, demonic orange glow that cast huge, dancing, terrifying shadows on the packed earth walls. And in this hellish, cramped, dark, and airless space, the true sound of the god's creation was happening. The bronze plates were lowered down, section by section, from the world of light above. They were cold and dark, their curved surfaces slick with condensation from the damp air. They were manoeuvred into place, their edges overlapping. The sound of the hammers was different here. It was not the proud, ringing clang of the open-air forge. It was a brutal, deafening thud, a concussive, painful, dead sound that had nowhere to go. It hit the ears and chest at the same time, a physical, sickening punch. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of the hammer on the bronze plate, backed by the iron skeleton, was absorbed instantly by the tons and tons of earth surrounding them. It could not ring, it could only thud. The rivets, pulled glowing white from the small forges, hissed as they were driven through the holes. The smell of ozone and searing metal was sharp, overpowering. The men, their faces black with soot and sweat, their eyes red-rimmed from the smoke, worked in this deafening, pounding, subterranean darkness. They were not building a statue to the sun. They were trapped in a mine, assembling a golem in the dark. For 12 years the city of Rhodes did not see its god. They saw only the Shroud, the great, brown, ever-growing mountain of earth. They watched the ramp get taller, creeping higher than the city walls, higher than the temple of Athena. It became the new landmark. Sailors returning home no longer looked for the Acropolis. They looked for the hill, the great, strange, silent hill that squatted in their harbour. They lived in the shadow of the process. They tasted the dust of the ramp in their wine, in their bread. The air of their city was the breath of a construction site. They knew, somewhere in the thud, 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 they could feel in their feet that the god was in there. But he was a secret. He was hidden, a promise buried in a tomb of his own making, waiting in the dark for the day of his own resurrection. It was the end. It was the highest, darkest, most airless, and most holy place in the construction. 100 feet above the harbour, but still buried, still entombed in the man-made mountain of earth. The workers, their bodies slick with a sweat that was half condensation, half exertion, toiled in a space so cramped they could not stand straight. The air was a hot, metallic, unbreathable soup, thick with the smoke of the last, highest forge, and the dry, powdery, choking dust of the earthen shroud. This was the forge of the face, the forge of the crown. Here they were not hammering great broad plates, but the final, glorious, terrifying pieces. They were hammering the light, the 7 great rays of the sun god, each one a tapering spike of bronze the size of a ship's spar, had been cast below and hauled up one by one into this stifling subterranean chamber at the peak. The sound of the hammers was a sharp, frantic, deadened thing, a thwack, thwack, thwack that had no air to ring in. It was a sound that punched you in the ears, a desperate, rapid-fire thud of rivets being set, of seams being joined in the suffocating dark. The heat was an enemy. The glowing hot rivets, pulled from the small, gasping forge, would hiss violently as they were placed. The sound a sharp, angry "see" as the metal met the cold bronze. The smell of ozone and seared metal was so thick it was a taste, a bitter, chemical coating on the tongue. The only light was the angry, pulsing orange of the forge. Fire glinting off the bronze skin, glinting off the rivers of sweat on the men's faces, casting monstrous, leaping shadows on the packed earth walls. In this flickering, hellish light, they assembled the face of the god, a lip 10 feet wide, an eye closed bigger than a shield, and now the crown. They were riveting the very rays of the sun by the light of a tiny man-made fire deep within the earth. And then a new sound. Silence. The final hammer blow did not ring. It just stopped. The echo died, smothered by the earth. The thud, thud, thud that had been the city's second heartbeat for 12 long years was over. The men, too exhausted to cheer, just leaned against the packed earth walls, their chests heaving, the sudden vast silence ringing in their ears louder than any hammer. The air was suddenly, shockingly still. Into this silence one man climbed, chairs of Lindos. He was not the man who had laid the first stone. 12 years had carved lines into his face, had greyed the hair at his temples. He was slower. His knees ached from the damp. He climbed the endless, dark, internal ladders, his hand on the rough, iron skeleton, the bones he had designed. He smelled the new, profound silence. It was a smell of completion. The hot, angry smell of the forge was gone. All that remained was the cold, metallic smell of the bronze itself, and the deep, damp, mineral-rich smell of the earth, the grave smell of the shroud. He reached the top. He stood in the chamber of the god's head. One worker, holding a single sputtering oil lamp, was all that remained. The light was small, a tiny flickering yellow flame in the vast bronze-lined darkness. It was not enough to see, it was only enough to reveal. The flame cast a small, trembling pool of light. Shares stepped forward, and the light caught the curve of a colossal cheek. He reached out his hand, the hand that had first sketched this form in charcoal. His fingers, calloused and worn, touched the bronze. It was cold, so cold. A deep, profound, metallic coldness, the cold of a deep well. He ran his hand over the surface. He felt the skin of his god. He felt the smooth, perfect, almost liquid-feeling curve of the bronze, and then the slight, rough, raised circle of a rivet head. He felt the craft. He felt the seams, the places where the world of war had been melted, poured, and rejoined. He stepped back. The tiny lamp flame glinted in the curve of a giant closed eye. He was standing, a tiny, breathing, warm mortal, inside the head of his creation. He had built a god, but he had never seen him, not in the light. He had only seen him in these pieces, in this darkness. He motioned. The last worker extinguished the lamp, a hiss, and then a darkness so complete, so profound. It was a physical pressure. It was the darkness of the tomb, the darkness of the deep earth. The only sound was his own breath, a small, fragile, hushing sound, and the faint, slow drip, drip, drip of water, condensation, weeping from the earthen walls. He stood there in the dark, in the cold, in the heart of his finished masterpiece. He had done it. He had built the impossible. He had anchored a sun god in a mountain of his own making. The year was 280 before the Christ. The work was finished. The god was complete, wrapped in his earthy cocoon, waiting, waiting for the light. The mountain was unmade, one shovelful at a time. The sound that had defined their lives for 12 years, the deep, muffled thud, thud, thud from within the earth, was gone. The new sound was a whisper, a great collective, city-wide shushing. It was the sound of thousands of shovels, not digging in, but scraping back. It was the sound of dry, packed earth sliding, of small pebbles rattling down the slope, of a million streams of dust flowing away. For months this was the work, the great brown sloping hill that had become a feature of their landscape, the hill that children had been born under, was slowly, painstakingly lowered. It was a disinterment, a careful, reverent unburying. With every passing week, the smell of the harbour changed. The air, so long filled with the dry, loamy mineral scent of the deep earth, was now sharp and gritty with dust. A fine brown powder coated everything, a new siege of dirt. But this time it was a film of promise. The people watched as the mountain shrank, and as it shrank, the god rose. It was a revelation in reverse. He was revealed from the top down. First, the 7 great rays of the crown, dark bronze black against the blue sky, like the fingers of a hand reaching from the earth. The workers, looking like ants, scraped the earth away from his face. They revealed a forehead, then a closed, massive eyelid, then the curve of a cheek. The god was rising from his earthen grave, borne backwards, from his head to his feet. The city did not cheer. It was too slow, too methodical, too sacred for that. They simply watched. And then, one day, the last cart of earth was rumbled away. The last shovel scraped the new, clean, white marble of the pedestal. The work was done. The mountain was gone, and in its place, a shape. The sun had set, and in the deep, velvet, wine-dark twilight, the Colossus was just a void. It was a pillar of absolute blackness, a shadow cut from the star-filled sky. It was a shape that had no detail, no colour. It was just a great, silent presence. The city held its breath. That night, no one slept. This was not the sleeplessness of fear of the sea. This was the sleeplessness of a child on the night before a holy festival. The entire city, it seemed, had gathered at the harbour. They sat on the cold stone of the quays, their blankets pulled tight. The air was cold, damp, and perfectly still. The only sound was the gentle liquid lap-lap-lap of the water against the stones, a sound so quiet it seemed to thunder in the silence. They tasted the salt on their lips. They smelled the cold, clean, pre-dawn air, herb, scent of brine and damp stone. And they looked at the great black emptiness that stood where the hill had been. For hours they waited in the dark, a collective, prayerful, silent vigil. They waited for their god Helios to see what they had made for him. Then it began, not as a light but as a change. The sky in the east behind the statue's back did not become bright. It became less dark, a deep, bruised purple, then a faint, cold, pearly grey. The stars in that part of the sky dissolved, washed away. The air grew colder, the dampness on the skin sharper. The people on the docks pulled their cloaks tighter, their breath pluming in small, white, ghostly clouds. A single ray of light, the first true, direct yellow light of the dawn, a searching finger of the sun god, broke the horizon. It did not hit the city. It did not hit the harbour. It flew, swift and true, across the water, and it struck the highest point of the island. It struck the very top, the highest ray of the bronze crown. At first it was a spark, a single tiny, unbearable pinpoint of light, as if a new star had been born 100 feet in the air. A sound rippled through the crowd, a sudden, sharp, collective gasp, the sound of 1,000 lungs inhaling all at once. And that spark, that pinpoint, did not just shine, it ignited. The single point of light touched the cold bronze, and it bloomed. A liquid golden fire began to pour. The light dripped down as if the god was being anointed. It slid from the crown to the forehead. The face, which had been a black shadow, was suddenly there. The bronze woke up. It was not reflecting the light. It was beaming it. It was a second man-made sun, blazing in the harbour. The light flowed down, a river of molten gold, over the closed eyes, the strong nose, the lips. It hit the shoulders and split, pouring down the chest, down the great strong arms. The statue was on fire. It burned with a cold golden flame, so bright, so intense, it was painful to look at. The city, which had been in the cold grey shadow of the pre-dawn, was suddenly bathed in a new light, a warm, golden, reflected light, coming not from the east, but from the west. The people on the docks felt a sudden, impossible warmth on their faces. They were being illuminated by their own gratitude. They had lived for 12 years with a dull thud and a mountain of dirt. They were not prepared for the light. They were not prepared for the scale. They were not prepared for the beauty. Men and women, the same people who had survived the siege, who had thrown stones and boiling oil, found tears streaming down their faces, the warm, wet tracks a shock on their cold skin. They did not cheer. The sound that came was a low, shuddering moan of awe. They fell to their knees on the cold stones of the dock. Their heads were bowed, not in fear, but because they simply could not look. The light was too much. The glory was too complete. Helios had come to Rhodes, and Helios in. The sky was greeting himself in the harbour. And so he stood. The fire of that first dawn did not fade. It returned day after day, a promise renewed with every sunrise. He was no longer a project. He was a fact. For 55 years he was as much a part of the world as the sea he guarded, or the sun he mirrored. 55 years, a lifetime. The children who had gasped at his revelation grew old, their own hair turning the colour of the white marble pedestal. Their grandchildren were born, and for them the Colossus was not a miracle. It was simply the world. It was the largest, most permanent, most real thing they would ever know. It was the first thing they saw in the morning, and the last thing they saw at night. He watched the city change. He watched the harbour bustle and grow, the ships becoming fatter, the sails more numerous. He was the great, silent, unmoving witness. The bronze in the baking sun and the corrosive, salty air began to season. He did not rust. He aged. In the deepest folds of his tunic, in the hollow beneath his powerful arm, In the spaces between the rays of his crown, the rain and the sea spray gathered. A faint, exquisite greenish blue began to appear, a patina like the colour of a shallow sea, a whisper of turquoise on the vast golden bronze. He was becoming part of the island, his metal skin taking on the very colour of the water he guarded. Far out on the deep wine-dark, endless blue, a merchant ship has been at sea for weeks. She is heavy with grain from Egypt. The men are exhausted. Their world has shrunk to the groan and creak of the ship's timbers, the constant weary splash of the waves against the hull, the sharp snap of the sail as it catches a gust. The air they breathe is nothing but salt. It is a taste on their tongues, a crust on their skin, a stinging in their eyes. The ropes they handle are rough and stiff with dried brine. Their hands are raw. The world is a rocking, endless, dangerous monotony. And then a man, the lookout, clinging to the mast, his voice cracked and raw from the wind, shouts. He has seen it. At first it is not a statue, it is a lie, it is a star burning in the middle of the day, it is a piece of the sun fallen from the sky, floating on the water. It is a single unbearable glint of light 20 miles away, so bright it makes the eyes water. It is a beacon, but it is not a fire. It is metal. The men crowd the rails, their hearts pounding, that dull seawater taste in their mouths forgotten, replaced by the dry, sudden, coppery taste of hope. They sail closer. The smell of the air begins to change. The wind, which had been only salt, now carries something new. It is the smell of land, the scent of hot pine needles, of dry, sun-baked thyme and oregano from the hills of Rhodes, a warm, herbal, dusty smell that speaks of home, of safety. The light, that single painful glint, begins to spread. It becomes a pillar, a column of impossible burning gold, and as they draw nearer, the pillar resolves. It takes a form. The men fall silent. The only sound is the shush of the water sliding past the hull. They are seeing it. A man, a god, his face, serene, powerful, is turned toward the rising sun, and the light is catching him, setting his entire eastern side ablaze. He is a column of fire. They see the rays of his crown, so high they seem to be scraping the clouds. They see the powerful, graceful line of his body, the form that Shah's had so perfectly balanced. He is not a crude idol. He is art. He is the grace of Lysippos, magnified to the scale of a mountain. To this sailor, this statue is the end of fear. It is safety. It is the promise of a calm harbour, of fresh water that does not taste of salt, of the feeling of solid, unmoving ground beneath his feet. It is power. It is the great bronze, unblinking statement of Rhodes, a warning to every pirate, every enemy, that the city protected by this god is not to be trifled with. It is a symbol that they are wealthy beyond imagination and that their gods are with them. And for the people who lived there in the harbour for those 55 years, he became the rhythm of their lives. To live in the shadow of the giant was to live in a world of constant, gentle, golden light. The sun would strike the bronze, and the statue would answer, throwing a soft, warm, diffused golden glow down into the streets. The harbour itself, the water, the whitewashed walls of the houses, all of it seemed to be bathed in a permanent, beautiful late afternoon light. And he was a sound. The great, hollow bronze and iron body was an instrument. When the strong Aegean winds, the Meltemi, blew from the north, they would split around his great legs, and they would sing. It was not a whistle, it was a note, a low, resonant, deep hum, a sound that you felt deep in your chest, in the stones of the street. It was the god's own breath, a constant, reassuring bass note to the symphony of the city. He was the city's sundial. The baker, his hands white with flour, would watch the great dark shadow of the god's arm begin to creep across the harbour water, and he would know it was time to light his ovens. The children playing on the docks would dare each other to stand in the patch of coolness as the god's shadow passed over them, a sudden moving eclipse. They would look up and up and up, their hands shielding their eyes at the face that was so high it seemed to be in conversation with the sky. He was not a statue, he was a neighbour. He was the guardian, the timepiece, the protector, and the pride of their world. For 55 golden, brilliant years, he was the sailor's guiding star and the beating bronze heart of Rhodes. It began with a stillness, a wrongness in the air. For 55 years, the city had been lulled by the god's song, the deep, resonant hum of the wind in his hollow bronze body. Now the hum stopped. The air on a perfectly clear, bright, windless day became suddenly terribly still. The birds in the marketplace, usually a riot of chirps and fluttering, fell silent. The incessant high-pitched sss of the cicadas in the olive groves ceased. It was a silence that was not empty. It was a silence that was holding its breath. And then a sound came, not from the air, from beneath. It was not a sound at first, but a feeling, a vibration that came up from the deep, ancient rock of the island itself. It was a low, liquid shiver, a vibration that came through the soles of the sandals, up the legs, and settled deep in the teeth. The wine in the amphorae, the water in the household cisterns, began to ripple, to slosh against its clay confines, untouched. The ground, the solid, dependable stone of Rhodes, suddenly felt liquid. It felt sick. A low groan began, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the sound of the earth's own bones grinding together in a deep, subterranean agony. This was the year 226 before the Christ, and the island, the very foundation of their world, was trembling. The people, stumbling out of their homes, their hands braced against the suddenly unreliable walls, looked up. They looked, as they always did, for their protector, and their protector was moving. For the first time in his life, the god, the unmoving, eternal sentinel, moved. The earth heaved, a violent sideways, sickening lurch. The god swayed, and he screamed. It was a sound that would be seared into the memory of every soul who heard it, a sound that would haunt their sleep for all their lives. It was not the majestic, resonant hum of the wind. It was a shriek, a high-pitched, metallic, agonizing sound of 100 tons of bronze skin being torqued. It was the sound of a god's armor being twisted, of giant iron internal bones bending. It was a groan so deep and so loud that it drowned the very roar of the earth itself. The iron skeleton, the hidden strength, was fighting, and then the sound that cut through the chaos, the sound that sealed the doom. It was not a groan, it was a snap. It was the loudest sound the world had ever heard. A single, sharp, explosive sound, like a thunderclap, but with no rain. A sound like the sky itself had been cracked in two. It was the sound of stone, the white marble pedestal, the great powerful knees, the perfect, beautiful, load-bearing joint, failed. The marble, strained beyond its limits by the twisting iron, did not bend. It shattered, a concussive, deafening, final crack that struck the people on the docks like a physical blow. The god's knees had broken. There was a pause, a single, impossible, heart-stopping moment of pure, unnatural silence. The snap had echoed, and then nothing. It was the pause of gravity, the pause of the unbelievable, as the Colossus, free from its anchor, tilted. He did not fall fast. He leaned, a slow, majestic, terrifying, graceful lean, a shadow, a great, dark, god-shaped wing swept across the harbour, a sudden cold eclipse that swallowed the sun. The air itself screamed. As the giant fell, he pushed the sky, creating a wind, a deafening, low roar of displaced air, a sound like 1,000 giant sails being ripped in a gale. And then the impact. It was not a sound. It was the end of sound. It was a concussion. A single, earth-shattering K-R-A-Kum, thum. That was so loud it was its own silence, a force that punched the very breath from the lungs of the city, a man-made earthquake that threw people from their feet. It was a symphony of finality. It was the hollow, resonant clang of the god's chest and face, a sound like 1,000 giant bronze bells all being struck, all at once. It was the deep, wet thud as his body crushed the stone quays, the wooden piers, the little whitewashed houses that stood in his way. It was the sudden, violent hiss and splash as his arm, his great godlike hand, plunged into the harbour, throwing a tsunami of cold, salty water, fish, and black mud into the streets. It was the final, sickening rumble as the tons of stone ballast, his secret heavy guts, burst from his broken bronze legs, a river of rubble, the island reclaiming its own. The world was gone, replaced by a cloud. The air was no longer air. It was a hot, thick, choking, unbreathable thing. It was the dust of the earthquake, but now it was the dust of the god, a suffocating, gritty, hot powder of pulverized marble, a chalky white that mingled with the black, sulphurous smoke of the earth and the brown, pulverized dust of a dozen crushed buildings. It was a taste, a thick, metallic, bitter paste that coated the tongue, the throat. It was the taste of iron and stone and loss. The cloud, this hot funeral shroud, hung in the air, and the silence beneath it was absolute. The hum was gone. The crash was over. The earth was still. The only sound was the faint, ghostly hiss of the dust as it began to settle, a sound like 1,000,000 whispering snakes, the sound of water, drip, 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 raining down from the sky, the echo of the great splash. And then, as the dust, like a curtain, slowly began to clear, the new sound came, the sound that would define the rest of their lives, a human sound, a low, wretched moan, the sound of a woman somewhere weeping. The sun, Helios, his own sun, kept rising. Its light was a sick, reddish yellow, filtered through the hanging, gritty air, and the light revealed the impossible, the unthinkable, the sacrilege. The harbour was a graveyard. The sky was empty. It was a huge, gaping, wrong hole, a space where the god should have been. And the god was fallen. He was not a god. He was a corpse. He lay broken, twisted, undignified across the docks he was meant to protect. His head, the serene, beautiful, burning face, was half in, half out of the water, its bronze skin ripped open, its hollow, dark insides exposed. The hand that had held the sky, lay in the street, crushing a wine merchant's cart. And the knees, the proud white marble knees, were just a stump, a shattered, jagged, pitiful ruin of iron and stone and broken promise. The silence was complete. The god was dead. The dust of the fall did not settle in a day. For months the city breathed its god. The taste of that day, A gritty, metallic, chalky paste of pulverized marble and powdered iron lingered on every tongue, in every cup of wine. The city was a wounded thing, its great empty sky a constant, weeping reminder. The first instinct, of course, was repair. The shout of the masons, the call of the engineers, "We will rebuild him, we will raise him." The forges were still warm, the memory of the craft still fresh. But a shout, however loud, can be silenced by a whisper. A delegation, their robes still grey with the dust of the ruin, made the journey. They crossed the sea, the creak of their ship a nervous, anxious sound, to the centre of the world, to Delphi. They entered the cool, sacred, stone-lined chamber, the air thick with a smell that was not the sea, not the sun. It was the smell of the earth, a deep, damp, volcanic, sulphurous smell mixed with the sweet, cloying, narcotic scent of burning bay leaves. They put their question to the god, and the priestess, a woman lost in the god's breath, did not look at them. She hissed, a dry, sibilant whisper, a sound like a snake moving over old parchment. And the words she spoke, carried on that strange, sweet, terrifying smoke, were not a comfort. They were a command. Kinait tami kinait. Do not move the things that must not be moved. The delegation returned, their faces pale. The whisper from Delphi was louder than any hammer. The gods were jealous, or perhaps the fall itself had been a message. To raise him again would be hubris. It would be a challenge. And so the city, in a collective, silent, terrified act of obedience, stopped. The god would not be raised. He would be left. He was no longer a monument. He was a relic, a holy, untouchable, broken thing. And the fear of the gods was now a scent, stronger and sharper than the metallic tang of the ruin. And so he slept. The years began to pass, flowing around his broken form like the sea water that now lapped at his face. The decades turned into a century. The 800 years of his slumber began. The generation that had heard the snap of his knees grew old and died. Their children, who had lived in the smell of the dust, grew old and died. The memory of the terror faded, and a new, strange and powerful thing took its place. The ruin became the new wonder. He was no longer a failure. He was geography. He became a mountain range of bronze, a fallen god whose corpse was more famous than his living form. The sound of the ruin changed. The echoes of the crash, the weeping, the whispered oracle, they all faded. The new sound was the cry of the gulls. They were the first to reclaim him. They nested in the great, hollow, cavernous, ripped-open arm of the god, their white forms a stark, living contrast to the darkening bronze. Their sharp, screeching cries echoed from within his chest. The sound of the harbour, The gentle lap, lap, lap of the water now played inside his broken body, a hollow, resonant liquid music, a sound of time and tide patiently, endlessly washing the great metal corpse. The smell of him changed too. The sharp, ozonic, hot metal smell of his birth and death was gone. Now he smelled of time, he smelled of the sea, he smelled of the sharp, green copper tang of his own slow, dignified decay. He smelled of the damp, earthy, green scent of the mosses that began to grow in the shadow of his neck. Centuries passed. A ship arrived, bearing a man, a Roman, Pliny. He was not a wide-eyed tourist. He was a scholar, an encyclopedist, a man who had seen everything, who collected the world in words. He stepped onto the docks of Rhodes, the summer air thick with its usual song, the smell of hot thyme from the hills, the smell of fish and brine and dusty streets. But all of it was secondary to the smell of the ruin, that sharp, pervasive green metal smell of the giant. He walked, his sandals scuffing on the stones, until he stood in the shadow of the great fallen hand. It lay in the middle of the plaza, a thing of impossible scale. He was an old man, and he looked at it, the scratch, scratch, scratch of his assistant's stylus on the wax tablet the only sound. He noted with his dry academic precision that the great, hollow, ripped open body looked like caverns, that you could see the secret iron bones inside, now rusting, a deep, blood-red weeping stains of rust that ran over the green bronze. But he was fascinated by the hand. He approached the thumb. He reached out his own mortal, wrinkled hand. He felt it. The bronze was not smooth. It was pitted, rough, made coarse by 800 years of sun and salt and wind. It was hot to the touch, a deep, penetrating heat from the sun. He tried to wrap his arms around it. He could not. His fingers would not meet. He motioned to his assistant. Two men, their arms straining, their tunics damp with sweat, could not encircle that single bronze digit. Pliny nodded, his mind capturing the scale, the fact of it. He dictated, his voice quiet, almost reverent, filled with a scholar's awe. Few men can clasp the thumb. He was touching a legend that was cold and hot and green and overwhelmingly real. But the awe of the scholar, like the fear of the oracle, also faded, giving way to something far more intimate. The last centuries of the slumber belonged to the children. The giant was no longer a god. He was no longer a holy relic. He was simply there. He was a park. He was the greatest playground in the world. The sound of the ruin became laughter. The high, piercing, joyful shrieks of children replaced the cries of the gulls. They felt no fear. They felt no awe. They felt only the shape of him, the pat-pat-pat of their small, bare, dirty feet on the great, curved, bronze-plated back. They had worn paths on him. The bronze was polished to a bright, slippery green gold on his shoulder, the world's greatest, smoothest slide. They would climb up his side, their small hands gripping the pitted seams, the rough patina, the furry, damp moss that grew thick and green in the crevices. He was a place of endless, wonderful smells. The damp, green smell of the moss, the sharp, metal smell when the sun was high and the bronze was too hot to touch, the cool, dark, cave-like smell from inside his hollow arm, a perfect secret hiding place, and the clean salt smell as they stood on the end of a great bronze finger, holding their noses and leaping with a shout into the bright, clear green water of the harbour. He was the quiet, moss-covered giant. He was a tomb, a wonder, and a geography. But for the last, he was just a home. He was the sleeping, patient, bronze guardian of their games. The slumber was long, but it was not eternal. 800 years he lay, a mountain of green bronze, a feature of the landscape. 800 years the gulls nested in his hollow arm, and the children wore his shoulder smooth as a slide. He was a ruin, yes, but he was their ruin. He was the quiet, sleeping giant. But the world, the restless human world, had turned many times. The Romans had come and gone. The world had a new god, and now new men from the south were masters of Rhodes. They came not with swords, but with scales. The new masters did not see a fallen god. They did not see a holy relic of a defeated oracle. They did not see art. They saw weight. They saw a quarry, not of stone, but of metal. And so a man arrived, a merchant from Edessa, a man whose hands were stained not with ink, but with the grit of commerce. He smelled not of the sea, but of the desert. He smelled of dust and camel musk and the dry, aromatic scent of spices from 1,000 miles away. He stood before the ruin, but he did not look at the face. He walked to the great broken leg. He pulled a small, sharp iron chisel from his belt, and with a tap of a hammer he chipped at the god. A small, bright, golden-green flake of bronze fell into his palm. He felt it. He weighed it. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. The gritty texture, the centuries of patina, the thickness of it. He tasted it, a sharp, bitter, battery tang on his tongue. This was not a god. This was valuable. The deal was struck, not in a temple, but in a dusty office. The sound was not a prayer, but the clink and slither of gold coins being counted, the scratch of a reed pen on a dry, rustling sheet of papyrus. The god, the ruin, the wonder of the world was sold by the pound like so much old grain or hides or scrap. And then the quiet final work began. This was not the clang of the forge, it was not the crack of the earthquake, it was a deconstruction, a quiet, methodical unmaking. The merchant's men came, small, wiry, silent workers. They did not use great machines, they used levers and wedges and time. The sound of their work was a small, dry chink, chink, chink. The sound of cold chisels finding the old 900-year-old seams. They tapped and they listened. They felt for the weakness. They scraped away the thick, damp-smelling moss. They drove wedges into the rivet holes, the sound a dull wooden thud, thud, thud. And then the sound of the metal giving up, a high-pitched, tearing, squealing groan, a sound of ripping as plates that had been joined by fire were now torn apart by simple, cold iron, the scream of the god's final disassembly. They were not smashing him, they were harvesting him. They cut him into pieces, small enough to be lifted. The great hand the one few men could clasp was broken into its individual fingers. The serene face, the face that had burned with the light of the sunrise, was split in two and lowered unceremoniously with a grunt of men and a creak of ropes. The bronze dust, a fine green-black metallic powder, filled the air. It was a new, dry, choking smell, the smell of the god's powdered bones, which got into the lungs and stained the skin of the workmen, and as the pieces were cut, they arrived. The transport. They came, a river of brown and grey over the hills, 900 camels. They filled the harbour plaza, a vast, restless, living sea of animals. The sound of the harbour vanished, smothered under the new noise, the low, bubbling, guttural grunt of the camels, the jingle of their 1,000 bells, the shouts of their drivers, a language that fell on the stones of Rhodes like a dry foreign rain, and the smell, the clean salt air was defeated. This was the smell of the deep, dry continent, a heavy, musky animal smell, the sharp, acrid ammonia tang of camel urine, the oily, grassy smell of their hides, the warm, dusty smell of the dung. It was an invasion of scent, a thick, woolly, overpowering cloud that clung to the back of the throat. For weeks they loaded him. The thud of a bronze plate, a piece of the god's thigh dropping onto the wooden saddle, the clank of a finger tied with rough hemp rope. The camels groaned under the weight. They shifted, their soft padded feet shuffling in the dust. And then, one morning, the first camel rose, and the next, and the next. The great caravan, a line of 900, a snake of profit, began to move. The sound was not a crash. It was a hush, the sound of thousands of soft, padded feet shuffling through the city, shuffling out the gates, shuffling up the long dusty road into the hills. The sun, Helios's sun, rose, and it glinted, not the proud blazing fire of the god's face, but 1,000 tiny dull flashes, a sad, pathetic winking light from the pieces of scrap jolting and jingling on the backs of the camels. The people of Rhodes stood. They watched the last camel, its back piled high with the unrecognizable junk of their god, disappear over the crest of the hill. The jingle faded, the shuffling faded, the musk of the animals slowly thinned, carried away by the sea breeze, and then silence. They turned, they looked at the harbour, they looked at the place where the god had been, where the ruin had been. It was gone. There was not even a stump. The merchant had taken everything, the marble, the iron, the ballast stones. All that was left was a stain, a great, flat, empty circle of earth where the white pedestal had been, a scar. The people stood in this emptiness, and for the first time they felt the sky. It was too big, it was too empty, it pressed down. The harbour felt naked, ashamed, exposed. The wind that had hummed in the god's body, that had whispered over his sleeping form, now it just blew. It was a thin wind, a cold wind. It found no obstacle, it made no music. It just hissed, a lonely, empty, desolate hiss across the nothing. The god was gone, not with a bang, but with a sail. He had not been defeated by an earthquake. He had been erased by a ledger, and the silence he left behind was the loudest sound of all. 55 years. It is nothing. It is a single human lifetime. It is a breath. It is the space between a man's first cry and his final sigh. Kingdoms rise and are ancient in the time the Colossus lay broken. He slept as a ruin for 800 years. He stood for only 55. Why, then, why this one? Why does the memory of this one brief, shining moment echo so loudly through the corridors of time, while other, older, more durable things are forgotten? We do not remember him despite his short life. We remember him because of it. We remember him because his life was not a long, slow geological fact. It was a shout. It was a single, perfect, impossible gasp of human ambition. It was a statement, forged in the fires of a siege, that the answer to war was not a higher wall or a sharper spear, but a defiant, blinding, useless, and utterly necessary act of beauty. We remember because the audacity was so pure, to build a god, to anchor the sun, to answer the terror of the Helepolis with the grace of Helios. This is what we keep. The bronze is gone. This is the great, quiet truth. The 900 camels carried it away, and it was melted down. It became 1,000 other things, Perhaps it became the hinge on a door in Damascus. Perhaps it became the hilt of a sword, or the coin in a merchant's purse, or the bell on another camel. The metal, the physical thing, was torn, scattered, and dissolved back into the mundane human world. The iron bones, those secret rusted ribs, have long since turned to powder, to a red-brown stain in the earth. The marble is gone, recut or buried, or simply ground to dust. The statue, the thing, was mortal. It could be broken, it could be sold, but the story is not made of bronze. The story is made of breath. It is weightless. It can ride on the hiss of a whisper, on the scratch of a scholar's pen. The story is more durable than any metal. It cannot be melted. It cannot be weighed. It cannot be broken by an earthquake. The trembling of the earth, the greed of the merchant. These things only strengthened the story. They gave it an ending. They made it a tragedy. And a tragedy is a thing we hold in our hearts forever. The idea of the god in the harbour is the true Colossus, and it has never fallen. Come to the Mandrake harbour today. Stand on the stones where the deer now stand, cast in new modern bronze. The air is no longer silent. You will hear the thrum and gurgle of 100 small boat engines. You will hear the click of 1,000 cameras. You will hear the murmur of 100 languages as people stand and search and wonder. The smell of the air is different too. It is the sharp, chemical salt smell of diesel fuel, the oily scent of the harbour. It is the sweet coconut and vanilla smell of sunscreen on warm skin. It is the hot, savoury smell of garlic and oregano drifting from a seaside cafe. The world is loud, but be still, just for a moment. Let the noise of the now fade. Listen beneath it. Do you hear that? It is the wind, the same wind coming off the same blue bright sea, the same wind that Chairs felt on his face as he calculated the fall, the same wind that once hummed a deep, resonant note in the god's hollow bronze chest. And the water, listen, the gentle, timeless lap, lap, lap of the Aegean, kissing the same ancient stones. It is the sound of the harbour. It is the sound of waiting. The whispers are still here, caught in the stones, carried on the breeze. The harbour remembers. Now, close your eyes, breathe in. The air is warm and it tastes of salt. The sun, the great, unforgiving, powerful sun of Helios, is hot on your eyelids, a deep, penetrating orange-gold warmth. The sounds of the modern world are fading. There is only the wind and the water and the gulls. The harbour is empty. The sky above you is vast and open and achingly blue. But look with your mind. You can feel a shadow, a sudden cool eclipse as a form passes between you and the sun. You can almost hear a low metallic hum in the air, and then you see it. It is not a statue, it is a glint, a single, impossible, blinding flash of light, a pane of pure, golden fire. It is the sun caught, it is the sunrise held in the harbour, it is the light igniting the bronze. It is there, not in the stone, not in the world, but in you, in the memory, in the dream, the bronze dream, and it will never fall. It is safe here forever in the quiet of the library. And so we close the heavy cover. The image of the great bronze giant fades back into the mists of history. Its light extinguished, the story is finished. The book is back on the shelf, sealed with its secrets, and you can rest. There is nothing more to see, nothing more to do. The fire is low, the library is quiet, and you are so very safe. If you found comfort within these walls tonight, perhaps you will return to us tomorrow night. We will be waiting for you, but for now, just sleep, sleep deep. Good night.